Welcome to Betrayed Hearts Chronicles. I've always prided myself on having the kind of marriage others envied. Melissa and I had it all, or at least that's how it looked from the outside. 2 beautiful kids, a home in a leafy suburban neighborhood, and a routine that felt comfortable, even if it sometimes bordered on predictable. I thought we were solid. I thought we were happy. The day Ryan moved in was unremarkable at first. Melissa had been watching through the kitchen window, sipping her coffee like she always did after the kids got on the school bus. When I walked in, she barely looked up. "Looks like we've got a new neighbor," she said, her voice casual but her gaze fixed. "Single guy, I think." I shrugged, preoccupied with the day ahead. "Another bachelor in the suburbs. He'll get bored and move on soon enough." Melissa didn't respond, but something in her expression lingered, an interest that I didn't think twice about at the time. That weekend, the neighborhood came together for one of our typical barbecues, the kind where everyone brings their kids and a dish to share. I wasn't much for small talk, but Melissa always shined at these gatherings, her laugh carrying across the yard as she flitted from one conversation to the next. It was late in the afternoon when I first noticed him. Tall, broad-shouldered, and effortlessly charming, Ryan worked the crowd like he'd been living here for years. His white shirt was rolled at the sleeves, revealing tanned, muscular forearms, and his smile had a way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room. When he finally made his way to us, Melissa introduced herself before I could even open my mouth. "Hi, I'm Melissa. Welcome to the neighborhood." Her voice had that warmth she used when she wanted to make someone feel instantly comfortable. "Ryan," he said, shaking her hand. His grip was firm, his eyes lingering on hers just a moment too long. "Nice to meet you." I extended my hand, stepping in. "Jack," I said. "Good to have you here." His smile didn't falter. If anything, it widened. "Great place you've got here. Seems like a tight-knit community." "We try to keep it that way," I said, my tone neutral. For the rest of the evening, Ryan blended seamlessly into the group, chatting easily with the other neighbors and cracking jokes that had everyone laughing. He was the kind of guy people gravitated toward, myself included, though I couldn't shake a vague sense of unease. Melissa, on the other hand, seemed completely at ease. I caught her talking to him a few times, her body angled toward him, her laugh a little too frequent. Later that night, as we cleaned up the remnants of the barbecue, I mentioned Ryan in passing. "Seems like a nice guy," I said, stacking plates. Melissa glanced at me, her expression unreadable. "Yeah, he's interesting. Not what I expected for someone moving into this neighborhood." I didn't think much of it at the time. Melissa was friendly with everyone, and Ryan had been nothing but polite. Still, I couldn't help but notice how animated she'd been while talking to him. I chalked it up to Melissa being her usual charming self. The following week, Ryan became a fixture in the neighborhood. I'd see him jogging in the mornings, stopping to chat with whoever was out walking their dog. He started lending a hand with little things, fixing Mrs. Landry's fence or carrying groceries for the Mitchells down the street. People warmed to him quickly, Melissa especially. One afternoon, I came home earlier than usual to find Melissa chatting with Ryan in our driveway. He was helping her carry bags from the trunk, and they both looked up when they heard my car pull in. Melissa smiled brightly, waving me over. "Jack." Ryan was just helping me with these. The bags were heavier than I thought. Ryan grinned, his confidence unshaken. "Thought I'd lend a hand. No harm in being neighborly." I forced a smile, nodding as I grabbed the last of the bags. Melissa seemed unfazed, but I couldn't help noticing the way Ryan's eyes lingered on her as she turned toward the house. Over the next few weeks, little things began to catch my attention. Melissa seemed more distracted than usual, her phone always within arm's reach, her laughter softer when we were alone. At first, I told myself it was nothing, just the ebb and flow of married life. We'd been together long enough to know that not every moment could be exciting. But then there were the excuses. A quick run to the store that took longer than usual. A sudden interest in morning walks, something she'd never enjoyed before. I told myself I was being paranoid. Melissa loved me and I loved her. That had always been enough, hadn't it? By the time the neighborhood had fully embraced Ryan, I was starting to feel like an outsider in my own home. Melissa was more vibrant, more alive, and I wanted to believe it was just a phase. Maybe it was the change in seasons. Maybe it was nothing. But deep down, I knew. The kind of change I was seeing in Melissa wasn't seasonal. It was a spark. And I had no idea how dangerous that spark would become. The changes in Melissa started subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. She'd always been the type to hum softly while cooking, to ask about my day, and to sit with me after dinner, our conversations meandering from light-hearted to deep without effort. Lately, though, her mind seemed elsewhere. Her phone would buzz, and she'd glance at it with a fleeting smile before tucking it away. She began staying up late, scrolling through her tablet with a faintly distracted expression. It was easy to ignore the cracks when life felt as routine as ours did. But even routines can mask fractures you don't want to see. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, I found her on the patio. She was nursing a glass of wine, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the string lights we'd hung years ago. Her phone rested on the table beside her. She didn't notice me at first, lost in whatever she was staring at across the street. "Everything okay?" I asked, stepping outside. She startled slightly, turning to me with a faint smile. "Yeah, just needed some fresh air. Long day." I followed her gaze and realized she'd been looking at Ryan's house. His living room lights were on, the faint shadow of his figure moving behind the curtains. "You seem distracted lately?" I said, keeping my tone casual. "Everything good?" She took a sip of her wine, avoiding my eyes. "Of course. Why wouldn't it be?" Her dismissive tone irked me, but I didn't push. Instead, I kissed her on the top of her head and told her not to stay out too late. Lying in bed alone that night, I stared at the ceiling and tried to ignore the feeling in my gut. Ryan became an increasingly visible part of the neighborhood. He joined community events, jogged along the same path where Melissa now took her morning walks, and even started attending the weekend soccer games where parents cheered on their kids. He didn't have children, but his easy charm made him a welcome addition to the group. Melissa, of course, was always nearby, her laughter a little louder when Ryan was in earshot. It wasn't just me who noticed. "She's been spending a lot of time with the new guy," Mrs. Landry commented one afternoon as I helped her fix her sprinkler system. She spoke in that knowing tone older women often use, her eyes flicking toward the street where Melissa stood talking to Ryan. "They're just being neighborly," I said quickly, though even I wasn't sure if I believed it. Mrs. Landry raised an eyebrow but didn't press. That night, I decided to broach the subject with Melissa. She was in the kitchen, unloading groceries she'd bought during one of her extended, quick trips. "You and Ryan seem to be hitting it off," I said, trying to sound casual as I grabbed a soda from the fridge. She paused, a slight tension in her shoulders. "I guess. He's easy to talk to." "Why?" "No reason," I replied, though I felt the edge in my voice betray me. "Just seems like you spend a lot of time with him." She turned to face me, crossing her arms. "What are you trying to say, Jack?" "Nothing," I said quickly, regretting I'd said anything at all. "Forget I brought it up." Her eyes lingered on me for a moment, searching, before she let out a frustrated sigh. "He's a neighbor, that's all. You're imagining things." She turned back to the groceries, her movements sharper than before. But I wasn't imagining things. The next few weeks blurred together, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore. Melissa grew colder, more distant. Conversations that once felt effortless now carried an edge, like we were both avoiding something neither of us wanted to name. One evening, I came home to find her laughing at something Ryan had said. He was leaning against the fence that separated our yard from his, a charming smirk on his face. Melissa's hair was pulled into a loose bun, her sundress swaying in the warm breeze, and for a moment, I saw her as Ryan must have, vibrant, beautiful, carefree. When she saw me, her laughter faltered. Ryan straightened, giving me a nod. "Jack," he said smoothly, "you're just in time. I was telling Melissa about my fishing trip last summer." Melissa glanced at me, her cheeks slightly flushed. "Ryan's got some great stories," she said. her voice a touch too bright. I forced a smile, though it felt like my jaw might crack. I'm sure he does. That night, as I lay next to her in bed, I couldn't keep my thoughts from spiraling. It wasn't just Ryan. It was everything. The way she dressed up more often, her sudden interest in morning walks, the way she seemed alive in a way she hadn't in years, but only when she wasn't with me. Do you still love me? The question escaped before I could stop it. Melissa stiffened beside me, caught off guard. What kind of question is that? I don't know, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You just seem different lately. She turned to face me, her expression unreadable in the dim light. I love you, Jack, she said, but her voice lacked the conviction I needed to hear. You're imagining things, but I wasn't imagining them. Deep down, I knew something was wrong, and the worst part was, I didn't know how to fix it or if I even could. Melissa's change was no longer subtle, it was tangible. She spent more time outside, timing her errands and walks perfectly to coincide with Ryan's routines. I told myself I was being paranoid, that my suspicions were eating away at me, but every time I caught them laughing together, their heads tilted slightly too close, it was like a punch to the gut. I wanted to believe her when she said there was nothing going on, but her actions didn't match her words. One Saturday, the neighborhood organized a small cleanup project for the park at the end of the street. Melissa was thrilled, eager to pitch in. I tagged along reluctantly, thinking it might help bridge the widening gap between us. When we arrived, Ryan was already there, wearing a faded t-shirt that clung to his athletic frame. He was chatting with a group of neighbors, but his eyes flicked toward Melissa the moment she appeared. She greeted him with a wide smile, and my stomach churned. We split into groups assigned to different tasks. By some twist of fate, or perhaps by design, Melissa ended up working alongside Ryan. I tried to stay close, but my section was on the other side of the park. I could see them from a distance, though, their heads bent together as they worked on a flower bed. At one point, Ryan leaned closer to hand her a tool, his hand brushing hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, she looked up at him, her cheeks flushed, and said something that made him laugh. The moment was fleeting, but it burned itself into my memory. That evening, I confronted her as we sat at the dinner table. The kids were upstairs, and the silence between us was deafening. You seemed pretty cozy with Ryan today, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Melissa frowned, pushing her food around her plate. What are you talking about? I saw the way he looked at you, I said, leaning forward. And how you looked at him. She slammed her fork down, her eyes flashing. Oh, come on, Jack. He's just a neighbor. You're reading way too much into this. Am I? I challenged, my hands gripping the edge of the table. Because it sure didn't look like nothing to me. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This isn't about Ryan. This is about you not trusting me. Do you even realize how ridiculous you sound? Before I could respond, she stormed out of the room, leaving me alone with my doubts. Over the next week, the tension between us grew unbearable. Melissa spent even more time outside, her excuses flimsier each day. One morning, I caught her leaving the house dressed in a flowing blouse and perfectly styled hair. An unusual effort for a quick run to the store. Where are you going? I asked, stepping into the doorway. To pick up a few things, she said, not meeting my eyes. Dressed like that. She froze for a moment, then smiled faintly. It's just a blouse, Jack. Don't overthink it. But I couldn't stop overthinking it. A few days later, the moment I'd been dreading came to pass. I arrived home early from work, hoping to surprise Melissa. Her car was in the driveway, but the house was strangely quiet. I walked through the living room, expecting to find her folding laundry or scrolling on her tablet. Instead, I heard faint laughter coming from the backyard. Peering through the kitchen window, I saw her and Ryan standing near the garden. He was showing her something on his phone, their heads so close they might as well have been touching. As I stepped outside, Ryan handed her the phone, and their fingers brushed. Melissa didn't pull away. Instead, she lingered, her lips curving into a soft smile that I hadn't seen in months. Am I interrupting something? I said, my voice cutting through the air like a knife. Melissa jumped, spinning to face me. Jack, you're home early. Ryan, ever composed, gave me his usual charming grin. Just showing Melissa some pictures of my last hiking trip. Didn't mean to step on your toes. I stared at him, my fists clenching. You didn't. My voice was tight, the tension crackling between us. Melissa stepped between us, her hands on her hips. Jack, don't do this. Ryan was just being friendly. Friendly? I echoed, the word bitter on my tongue. Ryan raised his hands in mock surrender. I'll let you two talk. Catch you later, Melissa. With that, he walked away, leaving us alone in the garden. As soon as he was out of earshot, I turned to her. Do you think I'm an idiot? Her eyes widened. Jack, nothing happened. You're making something out of nothing. Am I? I said, my voice rising. Because it sure seems like you're spending an awful lot of time with him. And don't think I didn't see the way you looked at him just now. She crossed her arms, her jaw tightening. I'm allowed to have friends, Jack. Or is that against the rules now? This isn't about friendship, and you know it. I shot back. For a moment, she looked like she was about to argue. But then her shoulders sagged. I'm not doing this with you, she said quietly, turning toward the house. Melissa, I called after her, my voice breaking. She didn't stop. That night, I lay awake, the memory of their touch playing on a loop in my mind. It was just a moment, a fleeting brush of fingers, but it felt like the foundation of our marriage was cracking beneath me. I told myself I needed to trust her, to give her the benefit of the doubt. But deep down, a voice whispered that I was losing her. And the worst part was, I wasn't sure if I could do anything to stop it. Melissa's behavior had become impossible to ignore. The emotional distance between us widened with every passing day, and no matter how hard I tried to bridge it, she seemed determined to keep me at arm's length. She was always busy, running errands, attending neighborhood gatherings, or simply retreating into her own world. I told myself that it was just a phase, that we'd find our way back to each other. But my faith was wearing thin. One evening, as I sat on the couch reviewing work emails, Melissa announced she was heading out. Where to? I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. Just meeting some of the ladies from the book club, she said, not quite meeting my eyes as she slipped on her shoes. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't let me rest. Melissa had never been part of a book club. The next morning, I found myself scanning the neighborhood as I left for work, hoping to catch a glimpse of her with these so-called friends. But there was nothing. Just a quiet street and the faint sound of a lawnmower in the distance. When I came home that evening, Melissa was already there, cooking dinner as if nothing had happened. She greeted me with a smile, but her eyes seemed distant. How was book club? I asked, leaning against the counter. She hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. Good. We're reading something by that author you like, Gillian Flynn. She didn't even know who that was. The truth came out a week later, though not in the way I expected. It was a Sunday morning, and Melissa was in the shower. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, and though I hated myself for it, I picked it up. The screen lit up with a notification. Ryan. Same time tomorrow? My chest tightened as I stared at the message. The casualness of it, the assumption that their plans were already set, sent a wave of nausea through me. I wanted to wake her up right then and there, to confront her with the evidence, but I didn't. Instead, I put the phone back and left the room, my heart pounding in my chest. The following day, I left work early, determined to catch her in the act. I parked down the street and waited, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. At exactly 2 p.m., Melissa emerged from the house. She was dressed in a way I hadn't seen in years. Jeans that hugged her figure, a loose blouse that exposed just enough skin to make my stomach twist with jealousy. She glanced around nervously before getting into her car and driving off. I followed her, my heart racing as I kept a safe distance. She pulled into the parking lot of a small cafe on the edge of town, a place we'd never been to together. I watched as she got out and walked inside, her posture tense but purposeful. A few minutes later, Ryan arrived. He strode into the cafe like he owned the place, his easy confidence a stark contrast to Melissa's hesitation. I sat in my car for what felt like hours, torn between the urge to storm inside and the fear of what I might see if I did. Through the window, I could just make out their silhouettes. They were sitting across from each other, leaning in close, their body language intimate in a way that made my stomach churn. When they left, I followed them at a distance. To my relief, or perhaps disappointment, they didn't go anywhere else. Melissa drove home and Ryan went back to his house. But the damage was done. That night, I confronted her. "Where were you this afternoon?" I asked as she stood at the sink washing dishes. She froze, her hands submerged in soapy water. "What do you mean?" "You know exactly what I mean," I said, stepping closer. "I saw you at the cafe with Ryan." Her shoulders tensed, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it. But then she turned to face me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Guilt, anger, maybe both. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice trembling. "Then what is it?" I demanded, my voice rising. Because from where I was sitting, it looked a hell of a lot like a date. She looked away, her jaw tightening. "We were just talking. That's all." "Talking?" I said bitterly. "You don't dress up like that to talk. You don't sneak around and lie about book clubs to talk." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't care. I was too angry, too hurt to stop. "What's going on, Melissa? Are you sleeping with him?" Her silence was deafening. That night, I slept on the couch. Or rather, I tried to sleep. My mind wouldn't stop racing, replaying the events of the day over and over. I wanted to believe her, to give her the benefit of the doubt. But the evidence was piling up against her. For the first time in our marriage, I wasn't sure if we could come back from this. And I wasn't sure if I even wanted to. I spent the next few days walking a tightrope between anger and despair. Every time I looked at Melissa, I saw her sitting across from Ryan in that cafe, leaning in as though he was the center of her world. The memory burned in my chest like acid. She insisted nothing was going on, but her words felt hollow. I wanted to believe her, but the cracks in our marriage were too wide to ignore. And then, one night, everything fell apart. It was a Thursday evening, and a thunderstorm had rolled in, drenching the neighborhood in a steady downpour. I was sitting in the living room, nursing a drink and listening to the rain hammering against the windows. Melissa had gone out earlier, saying she needed some space. She didn't say where she was going, and I didn't ask. I was staring at the clock when I heard the sound of her car pulling into the driveway. A moment later, the front door creaked open, and she stepped inside, her clothes soaked through and clinging to her body. "You're late," I said, my voice low but sharp. She didn't respond, her eyes darting away as she slipped off her shoes. "Where were you?" "Out," she said simply, brushing past me. The smell of rain clung to her, mingled with something faint but unmistakable. Cologne. Not mine. I stood, blocking her path. "Melissa, stop. Where were you?" She hesitated, her lips parting as though she wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words. "With Ryan," I pressed, my voice shaking with a mix of fury and desperation. Her silence was all the confirmation I needed. I stormed out of the house, the cold rain soaking through my clothes as I crossed the street to Ryan's house. My fists pounded on his door, each knock echoing like a gunshot in the night. It took a few moments, but Ryan finally opened the door. He stood there in a gray t-shirt and jeans, his hair damp as though he'd just stepped out of the shower. "What the hell is going on between you and my wife?" I demanded, my voice cracking. Ryan didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned casually against the doorframe, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Jack, calm down," he said smoothly. "This isn't the time or place." "Don't tell me to calm down," I snapped, stepping closer. "You think you can just waltz into this neighborhood and—" "She came to me, Jack," he interrupted, his tone soft but cutting. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I staggered back, the rain blurring my vision as I tried to process what he'd just said. Ryan sighed, stepping outside and closing the door behind him. Look, I'm not trying to ruin your marriage, but maybe you should ask yourself why she's here instead of with you. I wanted to hit him, to wipe that smug expression off his face. But I didn't. Instead, I turned and walked away, the rain drowning out the sound of my own ragged breathing. When I got back home, Melissa was waiting for me in the living room, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "Did you go to his house?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer. I just stared at her, my jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. "I never meant for it to go this far," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Go how far, Melissa?" I asked coldly. "Did you sleep with him?" She hesitated, and that was all the answer I needed. The rest of the night was a blur. We argued, screamed, and cried, the storm outside matching the chaos inside. She tried to explain herself, saying she'd felt lonely, neglected, that Ryan had made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. "I didn't want to hurt you," she said, her voice breaking. "But you did." I shot back, my chest heaving. "You destroyed everything." By the time the sun rose, we were both emotionally drained. She begged me to forgive her, to give her another chance, but I couldn't even look at her. "I need time," I said finally, my voice hollow. "I don't know if I can do this anymore." That night, I slept in the guest room. The bed felt cold and unfamiliar, but it was better than lying beside her and pretending everything was okay. For the first time in our marriage, I wasn't sure if we could survive this. And the worst part was I wasn't sure if I wanted to. The days following Melissa's confession were a haze of anger, confusion, and hollow silences. We avoided each other as much as possible, skirting around conversations that felt too heavy to bear. I slept in the guest room every night, and though the kids were too young to understand the tension, they could sense the distance between us. I went through the motions of life, work, meals, and small talk with neighbors, but beneath the surface, I was a mess. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured them together, Melissa and Ryan, sharing moments she'd once shared with me. The thought was suffocating. But it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Started small. Melissa stopped coming home on time, her excuses flimsy and riddled with half-truths. "The store was busy," she'd say, or, "I ran into a friend and lost track of time." I knew better. One evening, after another one of her late returns, I decided to confront her again. She was standing at the kitchen counter, unloading groceries she didn't seem to care about. "Where were you?" I asked, my voice sharp. She didn't look at me. "I told you. The store." "Cut the crap, Melissa. I know you weren't at the store." Her hands froze, a can of soup halfway to the cabinet. She turned slowly, her expression guarded. "What do you want me to say, Jack?" "The truth," I said, my jaw tightening. "Are you still seeing him?" Her silence answered the question. That night, after she fell asleep, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I needed proof, not for her, not even for Ryan, but for myself. I needed to know how far this had gone. Melissa's phone was on the nightstand, her screen glowing faintly with an unread notification. My heart pounded as I picked it up, scrolling through her messages. Most were mundane. Chats with neighbors, updates from school about the kids. But then I saw his name. "Ryan, I can't stop thinking about earlier. You looked amazing." "Melissa, I feel guilty. This isn't right. Ryan, but you keep coming back." I stared at the screen, the words blurring as rage bubbled to the surface. My hands shook as I put the phone back, my mind racing. She'd been lying to my face, sneaking off to see him while I sat at home trying to hold our family together. The next morning, I confronted her again, my anger barely contained. "I saw your messages," I said, standing in the kitchen as she made breakfast. Her face paled, and she set the spatula down slowly. "You went through my phone? Don't turn this on me," I snapped. "You're the one sneaking around, lying, running off to be with him." "Jack, please," she said, her voice trembling. "It's not what you think." "Then what is it?" I demanded. "Because it sure as hell looks like you've chosen him over your family." Tears filled her eyes, but I didn't feel any sympathy. I was too angry, too hurt. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Sorry isn't enough, Melissa, I said, my chest heaving. You broke us. You destroyed everything we had. Despite her apologies, nothing changed. If anything, things got worse. Melissa grew more distant, spending hours away from home with no explanation. Ryan, meanwhile, acted as though nothing had happened. He still jogged through the neighborhood, still waved at me with that smug grin, as if he knew he'd already won. One afternoon, I saw them together in broad daylight. Melissa was standing in Ryan's driveway, her arms crossed as he leaned in close, speaking in hushed tones. She looked nervous, glancing around as if she were afraid of being caught. They didn't notice me watching from the window, my fists clenched so tightly my nails bit into my palms. That evening I followed her. She left the house after dinner, claiming she was going to a community meeting. I didn't believe her for a second. I waited 5 minutes before getting in my car and driving after her, keeping a safe distance. She drove to a secluded park on the edge of town, parking near a grove of trees. My heart sank as Ryan's car pulled up beside hers. I stayed hidden, watching as they got out and walked into the park together. They didn't hold hands, but the way they moved, the way she glanced at him, it was enough to confirm what I already knew. Later that night, I confronted her again, this time with no pretense of civility. I saw you, I said, standing in the doorway as she changed into her pajamas. She froze, her face draining of color. What are you talking about? The park, I said through clenched teeth. I followed you, Melissa. I saw everything. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the dresser. Jack, I can explain. Don't, I interrupted, my voice rising. Don't insult me by trying to justify this. Just tell me why. Why are you doing this? She broke down then, tears streaming down her face as she sank onto the bed. I don't know, she sobbed. I don't know why I keep going back. I hate myself for it, but I can't stop. Her confession hit me like a sledgehammer. I wanted to scream at her, to throw something, to make her feel the pain she'd inflicted on me. But I couldn't. Instead, I turned and walked out of the room, slamming the door behind me. That night, as I lay in the guest room staring at the ceiling, I realized something. This wasn't just about Melissa or Ryan. This was about me, about what I was willing to endure and what I wasn't. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I had the strength to keep fighting for a woman who clearly didn't want to be saved. The morning after Melissa's tearful confession, I woke up in the guest room to the sound of the kids playing downstairs. For a fleeting moment, I almost convinced myself it had all been a nightmare. But the ache in my chest and the faint scent of her perfume lingering on my clothes reminded me it was all too real. Melissa avoided me for most of the day, but I noticed her glancing at her phone more often than usual. Each time, her expression shifted, nervous, guilty, or anxious, as if she were carrying a weight she didn't know how to bear. I told myself I didn't care anymore. If she wanted to throw our life away, let her. But deep down, I knew I wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. A week later, things took a darker turn. I was leaving for work when I noticed something strange. A piece of paper had been tucked under my windshield wiper. I unfolded it to find a photograph. A candid shot of Melissa and Ryan standing close together in the park. It wasn't from the day I'd followed them. This photo had been taken at another time. Scrawled across the bottom of the image were the words, "Does your wife know who he really is?" My blood ran cold. I glanced around the street, but there was no one in sight. That evening, I confronted Melissa again, holding the photo in front of her. Her face went pale as she stared at it. "Where did you get this?" "It was left on my car," I said, my voice low and simmering with anger. "What does it mean? Who is Ryan, Melissa?" She looked away, her hands trembling. I don't know. "Don't lie to me," I snapped, slamming the photo onto the counter. "Someone is warning me about him. Who is he?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but this time I didn't feel sympathy. "He told me he moved here to start fresh," she whispered. "That he'd been through some tough times, but he was trying to put his life back together." "What kind of tough times?" Depressed. She shook her head, refusing to answer. I didn't wait for her to say more. I left the house, ignoring her calls after me, and got into my car. I drove straight to Ryan's house, parking a few doors down. His car was in the driveway, but the curtains were drawn. My mind raced as I sat there, trying to decide what to do. Then, as if on cue, the front door opened, and Ryan stepped out. He didn't notice me right away, busy locking the door behind him. When he turned, our eyes met, and for a moment, neither of us moved. "What's this about, Jack?" he called, his tone laced with faux politeness. I got out of the car, the photograph crumpled in my fist. "Who the hell are you?" I demanded. Ryan's smirk faltered, and for the first time, I saw something other than confidence in his eyes. Something darker. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice was tight. "This?" I said, shoving the photograph in his face. "Someone's warning me about you, so I'll ask again. Who are you, Ryan?" His expression hardened, and he stepped closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "You don't want to do this, Jack. Trust me." "Is that a threat?" I asked, my pulse quickening. "No," he said, smiling again, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just some friendly advice. Go home. Focus on your wife. Leave me out of it." He turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, seething. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat in the living room with a drink in my hand, replaying the encounter over and over. Ryan wasn't just some charming neighbor. There was something dangerous about him, something I couldn't ignore any longer. Around midnight, Melissa came downstairs. She hesitated in the doorway before walking toward me, her face streaked with tears. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice shaking. I set the glass down, bracing myself for whatever was coming. "Ryan told me not to say anything," she began, sitting on the edge of the couch. "But you deserve to know. He has a past, a criminal past." "What kind of past?" I demanded. She looked down, wringing her hands. "He said he got mixed up with the wrong people, did some time for fraud. But I think there's more. He's been acting strange lately, controlling, possessive. When I told him I wanted to end things, She trailed off, her voice breaking. "What did he do?" I asked, leaning forward. "He said he wouldn't let me go," she whispered. "That he'd make sure I regretted it." Melissa's words left me reeling. Ryan wasn't just a threat to my marriage, he was a threat to my family. The next day, I took the photograph to a private investigator, explaining everything. He didn't seem surprised when I mentioned Ryan's name. "I've heard of him," he said. "He's got a history, fraud, theft, and worse. If he's in your life, it's not by accident." "What do I do?" I asked, my desperation clear. "Keep an eye on him," the investigator said. "And watch your wife. People like Ryan don't just walk away." As the days went on, Ryan's behavior grew more erratic. He started showing up unannounced, claiming he needed to talk to Melissa. Once, I caught him sitting in his car outside our house, his eyes fixed on our front door. I tried to confront him again, but each time he brushed me off with that same infuriating smile. Melissa, meanwhile, was falling apart. She jumped at every sound, avoided answering the phone, and barely slept. "He's everywhere," she whispered one night, her voice trembling. "I can't escape him." Neither could I. The breaking point came one evening when I heard a noise outside. I grabbed a bat from the closet and stepped onto the porch, my heart racing. Ryan was standing in the driveway, his hands in his pockets, a calm smile on his face. "Get off my property," I shouted, gripping the bat tightly. He didn't move. "Relax, Jack. I just wanted to talk." "Talk to the cops," I said, raising the bat. "Because the next time I see you here, that's who I'm calling." For a moment he didn't respond. Then he laughed, a low, chilling sound. "Suit yourself," he said, walking away. But as he disappeared into the night, I knew this wasn't over. Ryan's presence lingered like a shadow over every part of my life. Even when he wasn't physically there, the tension he'd created poisoned everything. Melissa's nerves were frayed to the point of breaking. I could barely look at her without imagining all the moments they'd shared, all the lies she'd told. And yet, my anger at her was beginning to wane, replaced by something far worse. Fear. Not for myself but for her and for our family. The private investigator I'd hired had been digging into Ryan's past for days, and what he uncovered sent a shiver down my spine. I met him at a diner on the edge of town, the kind of place where no one asks questions. He slid a thin manila folder across the table, his expression grim. "You were right to be worried," he said. "Ryan Jacobs has a long record, and it's not just fraud. He's been tied to organized crime, money laundering, extortion. He's never been convicted of anything serious, but he's dangerous." I opened the folder and stared at the photographs inside. Ryan shaking hands with men in dark suits, his name listed in police reports. It was worse than I'd imagined. "Does Melissa know about this?" I asked, my throat dry. "I doubt it," the investigator said. "Guys like him don't share everything with their targets." "Targets?" The investigator nodded. "Your wife isn't just some fling to him. He's using her, for what, I don't know. But he's not here by coincidence." That evening, I confronted Melissa. I placed the folder on the table between us, forcing her to look at it. Her face turned ashen as she flipped through the documents, her hands trembling. "What is this?" she whispered. "Ryan's real story," I said coldly. "He's not some charming neighbor. He's a criminal. And he's using you." Tears filled her eyes as she looked up at me. "I didn't know. I swear, Jack. I didn't know." "Then why did you keep going back to him?" I asked, my voice rising. "Why didn't you stop when you had the chance?" She buried her face in her hands, sobbing. "I was scared. After I tried to end things, he threatened me. He said he'd ruin my life, expose the affair, take everything from me. And now he's doing exactly that," I said bitterly. The next few days were a blur. Ryan's behavior grew more erratic, his threats escalating. He left notes on our doorstep, vague but chilling. "You can't run forever." Melissa became a shell of herself, jumping at every sound, barely eating or sleeping. I tried to stay strong for the kids, but the strain was unbearable. And then, Ryan made his next move. Melissa was at home alone one afternoon when Ryan showed up. She called me in a panic, her voice shaking. "He's here," she whispered. "He's outside. Call the police," I said, grabbing my keys. "I'm scared, Jack. He said he'll tell them everything." "I don't care," I shouted. "Do it." By the time I got home, Ryan was gone, but the damage was done. Melissa was sitting on the couch, clutching her phone like a lifeline. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed red. "What happened?" I demanded, kneeling in front of her. She shook her head, unable to speak. She handed me her phone, and my stomach dropped as I read the text message. "Ryan, I have evidence of everything. If you go to the cops, your husband will know even more. I'll make sure you lose it all." That night, Melissa finally told me everything. "He's blackmailing me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He has pictures, messages, things that would destroy me." I clenched my fists, rage boiling in my chest. "Why didn't you tell me sooner? I thought I could handle it," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But I can't. Jack, I'm so sorry." Her apology didn't fix anything, but it made one thing clear. Ryan wasn't just a problem for her. He was a problem for all of us. The next morning, I made a decision. I called the private investigator and told him everything. Together, we gathered the evidence we needed to take to the police. Not just about Ryan's threats, but about his criminal activities. But Ryan wasn't going to go down quietly. That evening, as I was locking up the house, I heard a noise outside. My heart pounded as I grabbed the bat from the closet and opened the door. Ryan stood at the edge of the driveway, his hands in his pockets, a predatory smile on his face. "You've been busy," he said, his voice smooth and mocking. "Get off my property," I said, my voice steady despite the fear bubbling beneath the surface. "You think you can just get rid of me?" he asked, stepping closer. "You think a few cops are going to scare me off?" I raised the bat, my knuckles white. "If you come near my family again, I swear to God." He laughed, A low, menacing sound. "You're out of your league, Jack. You always have been." But then, for the first time, I saw something crack in his expression. It wasn't fear, it was doubt. "You don't scare me," I said, stepping forward. "And I'm not letting you win." Ryan stared at me for a long moment, then turned and walked away. That night, I held Melissa as she cried herself to sleep. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than anger or despair. Resolve. This wasn't just about saving my marriage anymore. It was about protecting my family and making sure Ryan paid for everything he'd done. The morning after Ryan's latest threat, I woke up to the sound of silence. Melissa was already downstairs, pacing the kitchen like a caged animal. She'd barely slept, her face pale and drawn, the dark circles under her eyes making her look years older. "I can't do this anymore," she said as I entered the room. Her voice was flat, almost lifeless. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I already knew. She turned to face me, her eyes glistening with tears. "Ryan, the lies, the fear. I can't keep living like this." Neither could I. The private investigator called later that day with an update. "We've got enough to go to the police," he said. "But it won't be easy. Ryan's smart. He'll fight back." "I don't care," I said. "Let him fight." Melissa overheard the conversation and panicked. "If you go to the police, he'll ruin me, Jack. He'll ruin us." "Melissa, he's already ruined us," I said, my voice sharp. "What do you think is going to happen if we keep letting him control our lives?" "He's not going to stop." She broke down then, collapsing into a chair with her head in her hands. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, over and over again. I wanted to comfort her, but I couldn't bring myself to touch her. The weight of her betrayal still hung between us like a wall I couldn't break through. That night, everything came to a head. Melissa was in the living room, scrolling through her phone, when it buzzed with another message. Her hand trembled as she opened it. "Ryan, I know you've been talking to someone. If you think you can outsmart me, think again." She showed me the message, her face pale. "He knows," she said, her voice shaking. "Jack, he knows about the investigator." Before I could respond, the doorbell rang. We froze, staring at each other, the tension crackling between us. I grabbed the bat from the closet and opened the door to find Ryan standing there, his usual smug smile replaced with something darker. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. "You've got some nerve showing up here," I said, stepping outside and closing the door behind me. Ryan laughed softly. "Relax, Jack. I'm not here to fight. I just think you and I should clear the air." "There's nothing to clear," I said, gripping the bat tightly. "Stay away from my wife. Stay away from my family." "Your wife?" he sneered. "Funny. I didn't hear you complaining when she was in my bed." The words hit me like a slap, but I didn't let him see how much they hurt. Instead, I took a step closer, forcing him to back up. "This is your last warning," I said, my voice cold. "If you come near her again, I'll make sure you regret it." Ryan's smile faded, replaced with a flicker of something that looked like doubt or fear. "You think you're the hero here?" he said, his voice sharp. "You have no idea what she's capable of. She's been lying to you since the day we met." "What are you talking about?" I demanded. Ryan smirked. "Ask her about the money. Ask her about the things she told me to do." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there with more questions than answers. Inside, I confronted Melissa. "What did he mean?" I demanded. "What money? What did you tell him to do?" She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the door as if she were looking for an escape. "Melissa," I said, my voice rising. "Tell me the truth. All of it. Now." She broke down, tears streaming down her face as she confessed everything. "He asked me for money," she said, her voice trembling. "He said he needed help to get out of a bad situation. I didn't know what he was really doing. I swear, Jack, I didn't know." "And you gave it to him?" I asked, my chest tightening. She nodded, her sobs choking her words. "At first, it was just a little, but then he kept asking for more, and and I didn't know how to say no. Jesus Christ, Melissa? I said, running a hand through my hair. How much did you give him? She didn't answer, but the look on her face said it all. That night, I called the private investigator and told him everything. He promised to expedite the case, but I knew it was only a matter of time before Ryan made his next move. And he didn't disappoint. The next day, Melissa received an email with an attachment. Photographs of her and Ryan together, along with a message. Pay up, or these go public. She showed it to me, her hands shaking. What do we do? She asked, her voice barely audible. We fight, I said, though I wasn't sure how much fight I had left in me. Melissa and I spent the next few days gathering every shred of evidence we could find. Old messages, bank statements, anything that tied Ryan to his crimes. The private investigator worked tirelessly, building a case strong enough to bring to the police. But the damage was already done. Melissa's betrayal, Ryan's manipulation, and the lies that had consumed our lives left scars that couldn't be healed. For the first time since this nightmare began, I started to wonder if we could ever come back from this. And deep down, I knew the answer. The day I filed for divorce, the skies were gray, a fitting backdrop for what felt like the funeral of my marriage. Melissa sat across from me in the kitchen as I slid the papers toward her, the weight of the moment pressing down on us both. Her hands trembled as she picked them up, her eyes scanning the pages. You're really doing this? She whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, my jaw tight. There's nothing left to save, Melissa. Her tears fell silently, but I didn't reach out to comfort her. Couldn't. The unraveling of our lives had begun weeks ago, when we took the evidence against Ryan to the police. The officers had been skeptical at first, but the private investigators' meticulous work had made it impossible to ignore. Ryan was arrested shortly after, charged with extortion, blackmail, and a litany of other crimes. For a brief moment, I felt a sense of victory, but it was short-lived. Ryan's threats didn't end with his arrest. He'd built his life on manipulating and destroying others, and he wasn't about to let us escape unscathed. The fallout began almost immediately. Ryan's lawyers leaked damaging information to the media, pictures, text messages, and emails between him and Melissa. The story exploded, painting her as a willing accomplice to his schemes. The neighborhood buzzed with gossip, our once pristine reputation reduced to a scandalous headline. Friends we'd known for years stopped calling. Neighbors avoided eye contact, and even the kids felt the sting of whispered conversations at school. The shame and humiliation were unbearable, but what hurt most was the way our children looked at us. With confusion, disappointment, and a glimmer of betrayal they were too young to fully understand. Melissa tried to apologize over and over again. She begged me not to give up on us, swearing she'd do whatever it took to make things right. I know I messed up, she said one night, her voice breaking. But I love you, Jack. I still love you. I wanted to believe her. Part of me even did. But love wasn't enough anymore. You didn't just hurt me, I said, my voice steady but cold. You hurt our family. You hurt our kids. And I don't think I can ever forgive you for that. Her sobs filled the silence between us, but I didn't stay to listen. I walked out of the room, leaving her alone with her guilt. The divorce proceedings were brutal. Melissa fought hard to keep custody of the kids, but her involvement with Ryan, whether intentional or not, worked against her. The leaked photos and messages were damning, painting her as reckless and irresponsible. I sat through hours of testimony, listening as lawyers dissected every aspect of our lives, our marriage, and our mistakes. Melissa's lawyer tried to portray her as a victim, manipulated and coerced by Ryan. My lawyer countered with evidence of her lies, her deceit, and the money she'd funneled to him without my knowledge. It was a battle neither of us wanted but couldn't avoid. In the end, the judge ruled in my favor. I was granted full custody of the kids, with Melissa allowed supervised visitation. The look on her face when the decision was announced was something I'd never forget. It wasn't anger or defiance. It was utter devastation. I'm sorry, she whispered as we left the courtroom, her voice hollow. I didn't respond. What was there left to say? The weeks that followed were a blur of adjustments. I moved the kids to a different school, hoping to give them a fresh start away from the whispers and stares. I threw myself into work, into parenting, into anything that kept my mind from wandering back to the life I'd lost. Melissa tried to reach out a few times, sending texts and emails that I mostly ignored. She was living with her sister now, struggling to rebuild a life that had crumbled beneath her. Once, she came to the house to drop off a birthday gift for our youngest. She stood on the porch, clutching the wrapped box like it was a lifeline. "Thank you for letting me see them," she said, her voice shaky. I nodded but didn't invite her in. "They miss you," I said, and it wasn't a lie. Her eyes filled with tears, but she managed a faint smile. "I miss them too. I miss all of you." I didn't have the heart to tell her that we didn't miss her the same way. Months passed, and the pain began to dull, though it never disappeared entirely. The kids and I found a new rhythm, one built on honesty, love, and a determination to move forward. As for Melissa, I heard bits and pieces about her from mutual friends. She'd lost her job after the scandal, struggled to find steady work, and had cut ties with most of the people in the neighborhood. The last I heard, she was living in a small apartment on the other side of town, alone. One evening, as I tucked the kids into bed, my youngest asked a question that caught me off guard. "Do you still love Mommy?" I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I'll always care about your mom," I said finally. "But sometimes, people make mistakes that are too big to fix." They nodded, satisfied with my answer, and drifted off to sleep. I sat in the quiet of the house for a long time that night, reflecting on everything that had happened. I'd lost the woman I thought I'd spend my life with, but in the process, I'd found something more important: the strength to protect my family, even when it meant letting go. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.